On the surface, South Korea is one of the most remarkable countries anyone has ever seen, transforming from being poorer than most African nations to being one of the richest countries in the world in less than 50 years, all while its northern neighbour has remained economically backward. In this story, often told in the media, South Korea can do no wrong. But this doesn't paint the full picture. Beneath the glittering skyscrapers and world-renowned brands, there's a darker side to South Korea's rapid rise, one that's pushing the nation toward a dystopian reality. In 2020, South Korea witnessed 500 deaths from a strange new phenomenon, so strange in fact that it developed its own term, gwarosa, or death by overwork. At the heart of this toxic culture are a handful of powerful companies which run the country's economy and its politicians. In fact, just one of these companies, Samsung, accounts for nearly 20% of Korea's entire economy. In a land controlled by the few and not the many, people are switching off. For a country just to keep a stable population, every woman must have 2.1 children. In South Korea, this figure is only 0.7, 3 times less than the replacement rate. And in 2020, for the first time in the country's history, more people died than were born. The South Korean government are not new to coming up with solutions, from promoting actions like this on TV, to suggesting that girls should start school a year earlier to make them more appealing to men. It's just that none of them seem to do anything to address the root cause. By blending the harshest aspects of capitalism with traditional Asian hierarchies, South Korea has created a society defined by relentless competition and materialism, leaving many questioning whether this rapid rise was worth the cost or if it was just inevitable. To understand how modern-day South Korea became so broken, we first need to go back in history. The culture of stress and living under threat is not new, and at the start of the 20th century, Korea was invaded by Japan and occupied under brutal colonial rule for 35 years. But after being liberated in 1945, it was only 5 short years until another conflict emerged, dividing the peninsula in two. Occupation, World War II, and then the Korean War had left deep scars. South Korea was desperately poor and vulnerable to further attacks. Despite support from the United States, it became clear that the only path out of this dire situation was rapid economic growth. An educated, talented workforce, the government reasoned, would be able to rebuild the country and power its exports to the world. Under the leadership of Park Chung-hee, education became the cornerstone of South Korea's redevelopment plan. This intense focus on education tapped into a deep cultural drive for achievement, rooted in Confucian ideals of respect for elders, strict hierarchy, and an unwavering dedication to work. While this philosophy is common across East Asia, South Korea adopted it with a uniquely intense focus on academic success as the ultimate measure of personal worth. It is often said that the path to hell is paved with good intentions, and what began as a plan to rebuild the nation through education and hard work soon spiraled into an obsession, planting the seeds of the country's modern-day crisis. More and more people began attending universities, but before long, an anxious pressure around academic performance had bled into elementary, middle schools, and even kindergartens. In 2020, around 1/4 of all Korean students expressed symptoms of depression, and in the last 6 years alone, the number of 6 to 11-year-olds treated for depression has doubled. As education became the ultimate vehicle for social mobility in South Korea, families were driven to extraordinary lengths to secure an edge for their children. This obsession gave rise to hagwons, private academies where parents pour vast resources to ensure their children's success. Today, these academies form a $20 billion industry, catering primarily to those who can afford the high fees. All this pressure builds up to the CSAT exams, grueling 8-hour-long tests that can determine a student's university place and entire future. While South Korea has prided itself on being a meritocracy, the sheer importance of these exams has created a system that is anything but. Many of the questions extend far beyond the curriculum taught in public schools, favouring students who have attended these elite hagwons, and for lower income children, this essentially sets them up for failure before they've even begun. Why all this pressure? The ultimate goal for a Korean 18-year-old is to gain admission to one of South Korea's prestigious Sky universities, Seoul National, Korea or Yonsei, seen as the key to a successful career and a brighter future. Admission to these universities is typically only granted to students within the top 1% of performers, but in 2010, 46% of high government ranking officials and 50% of CEOs in the major financial industries were graduates of these universities. In many ways, these institutions are the be-all and end-all of Korean society, serving as the final gatekeepers of opportunities. Even outside of these elite institutions, around 70% of Koreans go to university. This is the highest rate in the world, which you may think is a good thing, but it has actually created an interesting phenomenon. Despite so many educated people, Korea also has one of the highest rates of youth inactivity anywhere in the world. Essentially, Koreans are either going to university or they are quietly giving up on life, or in many cases, both. Well over 500,000 young people are simply unwilling to seek employment, and 45% of these people who are inactive have a university degree. This phenomenon of people quietly checking out on life has become known as Korea's Sampo generation. This translates to the 3 sacrifice generation, the generation which must give up relationships, children, and marriage in order to survive in the modern economy. You'd think that after enduring a relentless schedule from kindergarten through a top university, your future would finally open up. This was once the case. In the decades following the Korean War, the ideals of hard work and diligence offered a path to owning a home, supporting a family, and collectively rebuilding the nation. Sacrifice meant not just personal achievement, but also contributing to a shared goal, transforming a war-torn country into an economic success story. However, today, that sense of communal purpose has faded. A survey done in 2019 found that 90% of South Korean women and 82% of young men believe that people born into poverty can never compete with those born into wealth. Education is no longer the vehicle for upward mobility which it once was, and yet people still value it so much. In developed countries, going to university usually rewards you with more pay, typically 40% more, while in the US that could be even higher. But in South Korea, this figure is just 20%. In fact, many students now find that their degrees have actually been a net loss, as they will never make back the cost of tuition. Unfortunately, as so many people have now gone to university, it isn't really that unique anymore, and in order to stand out, more and more education is required, creating what has been known as an education bubble. In a society obsessed with hard work, diligence meant eventually securing a home and raising a family, but now it barely covers the rent. That is, if you're lucky. However, in South Korea's capital, Seoul, this effect is extreme. Over half of South Korea live in the capital, and this is also home to the infamous Sky universities, the pinnacle of society. Since everyone who wants to do well tries to go to one of these universities, and most people who employ those graduates are also set up in the same town, the gradual build-up of people and some really restrictive regulations which prevent large-scale property development has made the housing market a bidding war, which is usually won by the elite in society. An unintended consequence of concentrating economic opportunities in a few expensive urban centres like Seoul is leading to the biggest problem facing Korea. Nobody is having kids anymore. In rural areas, children are often seen as contributors to family labour, but by contrast, in cities, the cost of raising a child skyrockets, while work-life balance has become nearly non-existent. But this is only one from a whole list of reasons as to why many South Koreans are simply not having children. Aside from the brutal work culture, the traditional patriarchal model of the early married, stay-at-home mother has deep roots in South Korean history and Confucian gender norms. But instead of clinging to this vision of bygone social relations, which are now nearly impossible to fulfill in Korea's modern economy, promoting a new one may help. Childbirth outside of marriage is still heavily frowned upon in South Korean society, yet the bar to marriage remains very high. This is because it is often associated with wealth, notably for buying a house. This creates a catch-22, whereby people envisage marriage only if they can afford a house. But affording a house is more challenging for unmarried people than married people. Many Koreans are now uninterested in marriage, but still want to have children, yet suffering the condemnation of having a child out of wedlock likely discourages them. In 2022, only 2% of births in South Korea occurred outside of marriage. The OECD average is around 40% and rises to rates like 60% in some countries like France. Giving legal recognition to non-married families would also help, and reducing social stigma around this area is one of the many levers the South Korean government can pull to fix the crisis, but one which they seem reluctant to do. What is adding to this problem and making people less optimistic about life is South Korea's job market. More specifically, the sheer domination of the entire economy by a literal handful of corporations. During South Korea's rapid industrialization, a few companies in particular came to dominate Korea's export success and in turn their economy. These are of course Korea's infamous chaebols. Companies like Samsung, Hyundai and LG, which place members of the founding family in ownership of management positions. The top 5 taken together represent nearly 2/3 of the entire Korean stock market's value. But despite such dominance, employment in these companies only works out to around 12% of jobs in the market. The amount of money controlled by these companies has meant that employment in chaebols has become synonymous with stability, prestige, and financial security. These family-owned corporate giants offer salaries and benefits that outshine most alternatives, granting them an almost magnetic pull on job seekers. In fact, Samsung alone is estimated to account for around 20% of South Korea's GDP, owning subsidiaries across almost all aspects of Korean life. This kind of corporate dominance is not normal. In the United States, the largest company, Walmart, accounts for around 2% of GDP. But aside from being absolutely terrible for smaller businesses, this dominant structure has bred a further wave of rigid hierarchy and toxic corporate culture. Korea's terrible work environment is well renowned for being one of the worst in the world, and has consistently been the worst place to work as a woman in the OECD for the last 12 years. Unfortunately, these strict hierarchies don't just lead to a stressful environment, but often have far-reaching consequences, not just for junior employees or newcomers, but for the entire society. This was made famous in Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, which follows the case of the 1997 Korean air crash in Guam. In this case, hierarchical structure prevented a junior pilot from reporting a critical error to his superior, contributing to the deaths of over 200 passengers and crew. But unfortunately, as Korea's economy developed, this hierarchy extended itself across society, where these chaebols were placed at the top of Korean society and devoid of any real accountability, particularly when it came to their relationship with the government. Historically, the chaebols have been seen as pillars of the nation's post-war economic success, and for decades, South Korean leaders have equated their achievements with national prosperity, essentially creating a relationship in which any criticism of these companies was akin to being unpatriotic. Politicians often rely on them for campaign financing and promote their successes as national triumphs, while chaebols lobby for favourable legislation and public policies. This cosy relationship, however, has become increasingly problematic for the country, not just in the waves of the scandals, from the Sewol ferry disaster, where over 300 lives were lost due to illegal modifications and lax safety oversight, to Samsung's bribery scandal, which saw millions exchanged for political favours and led to the impeachment of a president, but for actually slowly crippling Korea's economy. Structural rigidities in its labour and product markets have hampered productivity and innovation. Excessive regulations, entry barriers for startups, and the dominance of conglomerates shield large firms from competition while stifling entrepreneurship. At the same time, rigid labour laws, such as the seniority-based pay and strong protections for regular workers, make it difficult for companies to adapt to technological changes and new opportunities. Ultimately, South Korea's struggles with low productivity and inequality stem from a combination of hierarchical cultural norms, systemic corruption, and structural inefficiencies. Addressing these issues requires not only breaking the entrenched ties between government and chaebols, but also fostering a more flexible, competitive, and innovative economic environment. The result of all this is not just an economy which is slowing, but something far more serious. A society which is more suicidal, depressed, and ready to give up on life than any time in the country's history, and one which unsurprisingly people do not want to have children in. The response in Korea to their own demographic time bomb has been somewhat surprising, with some reasoning that the main issue may not be the rigid hierarchy or corporate-fueled expensive living, but in fact, feminism. While movements like 4B, which promote no relationships with men, certainly aren't making any more children, South Korea's demographic crisis far predates the rise of feminism as a widespread outlook and the 2017 Me Too movement. In fact, it was more than 40 years ago, in 1983, when South Korea's fertility rate first fell below 2.1, dropping to 1.5 in 1998, before reaching the worrying lows of 0.72 today. In December 2024, South Korea made headlines when their president tried to set up military law over the country. This once again shone a spotlight on a country that is often overlooked by its more controversial northern neighbour. But in many ways, it is a country with even more profound challenges. These challenges are not just the byproducts of rapid industrialization, they are woven into the very fabric of South Korea's success. The same structures that once fueled growth and prosperity now leave many disillusioned, burnt out, and unable to envision a brighter future. The question is not whether South Korea can change, but whether it's ready to confront the structures and ideals that brought it here in the first place.